Hello again, everybody, and welcome to Can You Hear Me? I'm Eileen Rochford. I'm the CEO of the marketing and strategy firm, the Harbinger Group.
And I'm Rob Johnson, president of Rob Johnson Communications. Here at Can You Hear Me, we like to help executives keep their fingers on the pulse of the workplace. And today's topic, what to do about disengaged workers, attempts to do just that.
That's right, Rob. So some really interesting recent research made it clear that disengagement is way up. And as we know, communications can solve everything, right? So that's what we're here to talk about today. What's the problem? Which is the rate of disengagement that's very concerning, and the solution, good communications delivered through the right people, et cetera, et cetera. So let's cover what that research was. ADP Research Index has been collecting data from 2,500 respondents every single month for nearly 2 years now. And they poll workers of all income, managerial levels, across multiple sectors. They cover it all. So that research is called the Employee Motivation and Commitment Index, the EMC, in case, we need a shorthand as we're talking today. Thank you. Yep. The index is built on 9 predictive elements, including engagement, resilience, and inclusion, and boasts, this is impressive, a 73% accuracy rate in foreseeing employee retention, kind of the holy grail. So in August 2023, that EMC index fell to 100, its lowest point since June of 2022. That's like 14 months ago. And the index peaked, this is for context, in December of 2022. That peak was 121. And that was after a year of robust pay growth, strong hiring, rise of remote work. And of course, let's point out that worker motivation and commitment, those things rise and fall. Everybody knows that over time. But this trend of the plummeting level and the high rate of disengaged workers, it seems like this is a critical point in like what's going on. And that's what we're here to talk about.
Yeah. And what's interesting too is the index peaked, as you mentioned, in December of 2022, less than a year ago. And already by August of 2023, it's dipping pretty severely according to the index. So that's some pretty interesting different numbers to kind of throw at you to give you an idea of where the high has been and where the low has been just in recent months. So that's important to remember. So you may be asking yourself, why is this happening? Fortunately, Eileen has a longtime friend that is an expert in this field. Mark Heisten has spent 25 years as a brand strategist and enterprise storyteller for some iconic brands like Apple, Microsoft, Visa, and many more. Currently, he's an instructor and teaching assistant at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he's also working on his PhD. So he'll be Dr. Heisten in short order, and he has somehow found a few minutes to spend with us here on Can You Hear Me? Mark Heisten, welcome to Can You Hear Me? Thanks for joining us.
Hey, hello. Thanks for having me.
I am just shocked that you were able to, squeeze some minutes out of your crazy schedule. It really is impressive, all the things that you do and have done leading up to this point in your career. But I just wanted to mention one thing that I think is the coolest thing about you. Now, this is totally aside from work. If I recall correctly, and please, for the record, make it, if I'm wrong, just correct it. You and your wife and your 2 children took a very long period of time off of work, and you traveled around. And I think it was in like an RV. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% correct. The one thing I would change a little bit about it is we took 2 years off.
Yeah.
We homeschool, or what they call road school, or world schooled our kids. Took them out of school and did that for 2 years. We did it in an RV for when we were in North America. And then when we were in other parts of the world, we did it with a backpack full of, very heavy backpack full of books and computers and everything we needed to do. So we did that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And I mean, if that doesn't speak to your appetite for learning and curiosity and adventure, I don't know what does. That's just, I've always thought that was one of the coolest things I've ever heard. And to know you and you did that, I think it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
And that road is the road less traveled. It was a long road, right? But it's the road less traveled. So that's really impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some days you wanted to get off that road, I bet.
But we were smart and strategic about it. We would do the heavy duty road work, and then we would go try to find some oasis of a nice hotel with a nice hot shower and things like that we could huddle in for like a couple of days, and then we'd go back out of the grit and grime of the road.
Nice. So that was like a reward if they got like an A or something. They got to go take a shower. That's good. Yeah. Or you guys got to go take the shower. Yeah, that's nice.
We did. Yeah, we left them in the RV. I mean, Yeah, no, yeah, it was definitely a reward for having, kind of muscle through, because they were little kids when they did it too.
Yeah.
So to carry a big heavy backpack for say 20 miles through the jungles in North Vietnam was not the easiest thing for them to do, but they did it.
That's just grit in formation right there.
Yeah,
I love it. Really good. All right, so let's get back to the topic at hand then. I just wanted to point out. So you're not just like brilliant, you're also adventurous and all these marvelous things. Since you spend, Mark, more time than I'd say most people thinking about this issue of disengagement and kind of communications in general and leadership and all the things that you explore in your research. Talk to us a little bit about employee retention as it relates to company employee identification.
Well, thank you. Yeah, let me kind of frame this up in a way. The study that you referenced before that was done by ADP specifically really kind of focused in on that sort of that disengagement or, that decline in emotional engagement. And what that does, at least for me in reviewing that brings to light the significance of, what you have identified as this employee company identification process. And this is really an alignment between the company and its employees, typically with respect to mission, purpose, a sense of connection that I've got a stake in what we're doing as an organization. And, before I go too deep on that, let me also just kind of define what identification is. And it's not uncommon for us to refer to brands or companies that we work for in a sort of anthropomorphic sort of way where we've humanized these companies. And in fact, that's what identification really is rooted in. It's this sort of unique personality or brand of an organization that's held by most of both internal and external stakeholders. So it can be employees, it can be the board of directors, it can be consumers, it can be customers out in the world who don't actually buy the product. All of them have some sort of an idea of what that company really stands for. And identification itself is really, like I said before, it's rooted in mission, purpose, and a sense of connection, but it also, incorporates a lot of things that we are familiar with, like visual representation. We think of like the brand as the logo and things like that. It's also the tone and the textual identity. It's what we anticipate or believe to be the culture itself, whether the brand has got a personality, what is that corporate culture? And then just generally speaking, what is the reputation? That for me is what I look at when I read a study like what you shared before. So I look at, there's definitely some problems between companies, what they stand for, what they represent for people, and then the sort of idea of how I as an employee connect with that.
So Mark, there's another concept here, I think, that dovetails off of what you're talking about. And when we're talking about the engagement question, we also need to consider the employee self-concept as it relates to the organizational identity. So you've touched upon the organizational identity, but explain a little bit about the employee self-concept and how that marries the organizational identity and how important it is to have those in alignment.
So that's a great question, Rob. And let me go back a little bit too. And I'm gonna. There's three components I want to make sure that I outline to connect the dots on that self-concept. Before I do that, I want to root this back in a theory that we use quite a bit, especially when we're doing analysis or doing research or scholarship around corporate cultures and kind of leader behaviors and kind of the cultures that leaders imbricate in their organizations. And that's social identity theory. And again, I'll describe this, but we all have a pretty, even if you're not, you don't have a background in the theoretical grounding of it, we all kind of intuitively, I think, understand this. And what it is this is a theory really that suggests that employees categorize themselves into social groups. It applies outside of corporations too. Social identity theory is at play in everything that we do in our lives. But within the context of corporations, it's how we categorize ourselves into social groups or organizations that are based on shared characteristics. So, and some of the characteristics are categorization, right? We have a very natural tendency to organize ourselves and others according to perceived or shared characteristics or values, areas of overlap. Like we were talking about before in traveling with our kids, a big part of that social identity for us was rooted in the idea of finding other families who were, similarly adventurous, willing to take their kids out into the world and use the world as a classroom in a lot of ways. So we naturally found ourselves kind of connecting with those types of people. Well, that comes from categorization. The other part of it, which can have an insidious flair to it, is a sort of social comparison. That's where we all tend to compare ourselves with other groups or other individuals. Social identity itself is also one element of an individual self self-concept, which I'll come back, Rob, to your point on that. And this comes from membership in a specific or a particular group. So I've got a self-concept, but my self-concept in many ways is reflected by the organization, the kind of group that I share time and spend time with, I guess. And then salience. This is sort of where we have sort of this affective connection with others. We're sharing at a very emotional level as how we connect with one another. Rooted in organizations and how organizations apply this sort of approach is what they consider to be factors of alignment. And these are things like, first are going to be things like shared values and goals. To what degree are the corporate, the department, the team values and the goals linked to individual values and goals themselves. Second is a perception of superiority. And that isn't as ominous as it sounds. What it is just where we as members of this organization feel like we're more innovative, that we're leading, that we're more supportive, that we're protective, or we're loyal to one another. There's this sense of pride that comes from being a part of it. And, honestly, humans constantly make comparisons to confirm that they're standing relative to others. So that's not uncommon either. Third, leadership and role models. That is, the leader who embodies those characteristics tend to be most valued by employees. And a lot of times these may be based on past, present, or future observations of that performance. And then fourth, communication. This seems obvious, but with all my years of experience in communication, corporate communication, public relations, marketing, advertising, you name it, strategic communication, the reality is that leadership is, capital IS, leadership is communication. So communication is the way that we know whether or not a leader is worth following. Communication is how we know how we're organized and aligned against that. Communication is how we make sure that we are engaged with things. And then kind of the fifth that I think is really important for us to note is recognition and acknowledgement. I think most people today, it's certainly covered in a lot of the business press, that never underestimate that pat on the back. In many cases, that's worth more than money. You were talking before about the research showed that many, the kind of the high point of this index was related to people getting increases in their salary. But, leaders know that a pat on the back, recognition, especially strategic recognition that aligns with what I consider to be my values and goals, is worth more in many cases than money. Now, how this all fits is around what you asked, Rob, which is about self-concept. And that's really the context of sort of this corporate identification process. And that's where employee beliefs, skills, values, experiences, personality are really coupled and contrasted with those of the corporate entity. The hope is that self-concept and corporate identity are pretty close to one another. Now, they can be quite different. And that's where you're going to run into issues. But the kind of the core aspects of self-concept are really, what are my skills and competencies? Do I have a chance to apply them to this job? Do I feel inspired by my leaders? Do the values and ethics of this organization line up with what I consider to be important? How do I feel about my professional identity? I'm sure that all of us, we go out, we meet other people and we talk about, people ask, what do you do? What is your role? And professional identity is a big part of this sort of pride that I have, this swell of pride that I have in talking about the company that I work for. And if that's not there, that can be a problem with how self-concept and corporate identification work together. Now, I'll kind of say one more thing just to kind of link these is this gets us into this sort of sense-giving and sense-making process. Sense-giving in the case of corporate identification is one where the corporation takes all sorts of information that comes into it, whether it be competitive threats, economic threats, COVID that we all went through, and provides some sort of sense-giving for all of its employees. In other words, what it does is it captures that information, it translates that into a way that we as an organization can start to address it as an organization and then as individual components within that organization. The sense-making part of it is getting back to what you asked about, Rob, which is that sort of self-concept is, am I skeptical of what the corporation is sharing with me? Am I seeing things that the corporation is not? So those kinds of things, I think that sense-giving and sense-making really puts a lot of onus on leaders to do a lot of translation work.
So fascinating. I'm just like sitting here going,
yeah, I'm glad you set the sort of baseline for us.
Yeah.
When I asked that question, when Eileen does, and it's like, well, here, let's go back and kind of define it. So you put some great color around that.
And you've made me really want to sit in on one of your classes. Wow.
The classes he's teaching or the ones he's taking?
I'm teaching, I think, because he just sounds like he's a great instructor. Yeah. Like that was so crystal clear in the way that you laid it out for us. And you piqued my curiosity on a number of levels. The first, which I'm going to ask you now, if that's okay, is I would really like to hear why. So engagement is down. So some of the internal dynamics that you just covered and the kind of issues that impact engagement of every employee and their sense of self or self-concept. Where the external factors that would influence these results or levels of engagement? What do you think?
I think that's a great question. There's a lot of external factors that influence both the sense giving, the sense making, and then specifically relative to what we're talking about today is this notion of engagement. And a lot of those can be generational. I know there's a lot of talk about the generational shifts. I've certainly got my colleagues who, they're in Chicago who deal in commercial real estate who are worried about the future of people coming together as an organization into a single location. When you've got a whole generation of a lot of the students that are in my classes are going out into the world and really like the idea of being able to work, say, for example, at a New York ad agency, but be able to do it from Boulder, Colorado, where they can go and ski and have fun. And I think there's an expectation of that. That's a generational change. Political differences. It seems that these days, everything is political and politicized. And so that creates some really interesting dynamics in organizations that, again, no matter how hard you want to try to keep those outside of the organization, they come in. Most recently, in fact, I just did some research on this, with what Netflix went through with respect to Dave Chappelle did a special that had angered and upset and was disparaging to the LGBTQ community. And under those circumstances, their employees first came, it was an internal issue initially. They came to Netflix and said, hey, look, we don't feel comfortable with this. This violates our core values as an organization. And they felt that they were not heard. And then that kind of spilled out into the street. So even when things are, ideally encapsulated inside organizations where we as coworkers and leaders and executive team can go through this sense-giving process, this sense-making process, and find ways where we can resolve our differences. Even today, that stuff is spilling out into the world. So, COVID-19 obviously sparked a lot. Certainly there was a big contrast between older managers that wanted everybody to come back into the office as quickly as possible, younger workers who wanted to advocate or were strongly advocating for extended or flexible remote work arrangements. And, there were even some within certain organizations that were resistant to the original mandate. So all that kind of that outside world comes in, and I don't want to say it infects, but it alters or changes or shifts the way that internal engagement, internal relationships work. And so it's really important that, to kind of recognize that these conflicts may define or predict kind of the trajectory of engagement between companies and their employees. There's trigger events that always happen at some level, at the organizational, the individual level. And just like with any sort of triggering activity, it activates a response that shapes really the direction that the company is going to do. The pandemic, right, created a sense of isolation and it commingled work life. Many people who, didn't have the ability, when schools closed, they had to bring that sort of education process in-house while they were also working a job. That sort of forced return to the office. There was a kind of lost time and a disequilibrium of work life. And then, I think just in general, the disharmony of sociopolitical issues these days has really created a number of areas of tension and conflict. That I think leadership can play a major role in this and helping resolve it. And I think that's the kind of the next step for things.
There's a couple things I want to unpack with you here, Mark. And I'm glad you brought up the Netflix thing because I was fascinated because this is kind of politics in general, which is people have beliefs and I respect everybody's beliefs. And I think we all do. But sometimes people's beliefs are based on things they haven't really researched. And I was really interested as you related the Dave Chappelle Netflix story. The Closer was the name of the stand-up. And he was really taking a lot of heat from LGBTQ and the trans community. And as comedians are edgy, and that's not to make an excuse for them, kind of framing things in a certain way. But that whole thing that everybody was so offended by, he was talking about his trans friend who passed away, who used to be a warm-up act for him from San Francisco. And he was going on and on and on about what a great friend this person was and how difficult it was and everything else. And yes, does he crack jokes? And yes, do some people get offended by it? But it was interesting because a lot of the Netflix people, I wonder how many of them watched the whole thing. Because if you'd watched the whole thing, he was holding this person up as a dear friend. And how he got there, we can all debate that. So I think that's the first thing that you brought up that I thought was interesting, but that's politics. People get something in their head. They may not have watched or read or researched a certain thing, but that's how the world works. So that's our world today. And I love what you said a little earlier about leadership is communication. And as a communications consultant, thank you for saying that, because I try to drive that point home all the time to potential clients and clients that, the world is different now. And if you're not communicating properly, that you're not leading, which gets me to my question. How do leadership style play a role in navigating all these issues that you're bringing up?
Yeah. So thanks for bringing back up the leadership as communication piece. That's something that I've felt and believed for a really long time since when I started my career and was working with Eileen, several years ago. Clearly leadership styles play a significant pivotal role, especially when you're navigating really complex issues. And again, like we're alluding to in all this is, those issues aren't, there might have been a time 40 years ago where those issues were really, for the most part, kept within the company, right? This isn't an episode of Severance, right, on Apple TV, where you've got your life outside of the business, and then you forget all that when you come into the business, the corporate, the tower. Those things are commingled. And so these things kind of bleed into one another. And honestly, the command and control approach that was, kind of that characterized by the demands of my way or the highway mentality, they're just simply not effective anymore. I think I will kind of draw on fiction as well, that I think is really important. One of the most obvious considerations for leaders is matching their style to the needs of that organization, the department, the team, or the individuals in that moment. There's a sort of, what we call ethics of care, which is like, I'm talking to you, Rob, and it's clear as my employee, you've got an issue. I need to make this just a one-to-one communication. This isn't a mass communication. This is just between us. I'm trying to help you address the issues that you've got. In other words, great leadership is one of being situationally aware. And in the fictional component of this is that I often think of Shakespeare's Henry V, and that's one in which the king walks among his troops on the night before the big battle, recognizing that they're outmaneuvered in a lot of ways. They don't have as much equipment. They certainly don't have as many people. And as he's doing this, he's cloaked so that no one recognizes him as anything other than another soldier. What he does is he adapts his tone so that each individual or group, they feel like he's connecting them. He really listens. He responds in a way that really sparks that inspiration and hope. Now, in fairness, even though leadership is communication, generally a leadership style itself is more fixed, right? And there's a lot of different kinds, right? There's transformational leadership. There's books on all of these. There's kind of the historic of transactional leadership. We've read a lot about charismatic leadership, right? We're in a world today where we're asking questions about autocracies and democracies. Well, autocratic leaders exist in corporations, as do democratic leaders. You got servant leadership, you got player coaches, situational, you got ethical leadership. All of those are things that are harder for me as an individual. If I consider myself to be a charismatic leader, that's kind of the nature of who I am. But how I communicate, the tone, the approach that I take, that sort of situational awareness that I've got allows me to take what is true of my style and really adapt it to a way that you need to hear. And I can adapt that sort of identification down to a level where it matches up with your self-concept. So I think that sort of leadership is powerful. And the best part of it is it's persistent. It lasts long after you and I have our discussion about what you need from our workplace. It's the kind of thing that will govern your activities, your actions, the decisions that you make, your sense of self-importance, your sense of impact in the organization. That sort of adapting my approach and how I talk to you as a leader really pays dividends over a very protracted, a long period of time. And by the way, Rob, one other thing on that too. I do think the authentic storytelling is one of the ways that we can kind of get into a space where me as a leader, I can impart on you the sort of wisdom of my experience or wisdom of what it is that we need to do. I can kind of through story really kind of activate and spark that sort of connection that you make, that engagement that you've got with the organization. That's an area that tends not to be all that comfortable for a lot of leaders to embark in storytelling.
That is such a great segue into, I know what Eileen wants to get into right now.
Do you? What is that?
Storytelling.
I know. Okay. Yeah. I'm just kidding. Okay. Yeah, I do. I want to get into storytelling big time, because I think what I'm curious about is when I think about disengagement, I think about disconnection, right? So obviously. So how do you foster connection with, everyone in your organization, especially the people you most need to, as a leader? And I'm guessing you're going to start with storytelling, Mark, and you're going to tell me a lot more about effective storytelling storytelling. Certainly, you see it all the time in the role that you play at Leadership Legend. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it also applies in the classroom. I think that's the funny thing about leadership, right? Leadership is not per se, it's not a title. It's a role that people play. And so in every aspect of our lives, that stuff comes up. I keep coming back to the context where we are right now in kind of broadly society. We are in the midst of a trust crisis, right? That is, almost all of our venerable institutions have been attacked by some political leader or some organization. They've been attacked from the inside, where they've made, some missteps that undermine the trust that they've spent the last 40 years or 50 years building up. Again, without picking on specific organizations, I think, Netflix in that case, they undermined a little bit of their own trust with the organization, simply because rather than have the debate as to what was said and how it was said and this and that, they actually kind of violated the values that they put out and asked and expected of everybody else to adhere to. And they just didn't quite follow it, or at least they were a little loose in their interpretation of it. And, you look around the world today, we're in the middle of a trust crisis. So this has created a world of insecurity for employees and for leaders too. I don't want to leave them out of the mix on this, but nothing rebuilds or institutes trust in leadership really like a good story, right? One that reveals a certain degree of authenticity, right? There's a thing in marketing called the service recovery paradox. It's a fancy way of saying that you actually are a more loyal customer to a brand if they make a mistake and respond in a way that really more than meets your expectations than if they'd made the mistake. If they'd never made the mistake in the first place, you'd have been loyal to them, but you're a lot more loyal to them after they made the mistake and showed you just how authentically concerned they were with the problem that they created for you. And that's a really interesting and surprising, counterintuitive point. Nothing also, kind of institutes this sort of trust and leadership, or the good story component of it is, a good story models the way. A good story shows how my leadership, my path, my hero's journey, if I want to call it that, shows you how you can lead your life. It inspires you in some way. Perhaps most importantly, it inspires or activates a connection between us in terms of both transparency and trust. Transparency, because I'm willing to share something with you about my life that was not so easy and not so good, in order to show you how I rose from that. I was like a phoenix. I rose from the ashes, and I can show you that you too can follow a similar path. That institutes what I consider to be the two sides of the coin, which is transparency and trust. If I've got trust, I don't need to be that transparent with you. If I don't have trust, I have to be very transparent with you. So what we want leaders that we can relate to at some level that's human. Too many times we've sat in meetings where a new leader steps into the organization and they're kind of reading their bio, and their bio is a lot of things that have to do with, their credentials, right? Here, I worked for this company. I was the youngest SVP at such and such corporation. It's a lot of chest beating versus something that reveals something that's more emotional, it's deeper, it's more personal, that can be done in a way that is successful for them and for the organization. Now, HBR, right, touts the benefits of leader vulnerability. It seems like every issue, right? There's something about leader vulnerability, but not very many of those articles illustrate exactly how to do it. And the risks are very high. If I under-disclose, I seem distant and aloof. I may even lead to, misunderstandings, or I might even be a forgettable leader. If, by contrast, I over-disclose with you, I reveal to you some really tragic thing that happened in my life, which is perfectly human. And, sometimes it happens in just a raw moment. What I may do is I may contribute to your own fear or frustration or hesitation about making any major decisions, because you recognize, and further, I'm anchoring myself, my legacy, on this tragic event that happened to me, not the leader that I've become from that. So the way that we work with leaders, certainly at Leadership Legend, but I think it's a formula for anybody, is really, we teach people how to follow what we call the wave story method, which is, it's a formula that's got natural drama that's built into it. It's valuable for listeners, and it's simply just 4 parts. It's, once you start off with introducing a decision of consequence. What was a really hard decision that you had to make in your life, where you knew on the other side of that decision, it was going to make a substantial impact on yourself, your professional career, your employees, your company, your family, your friends, your community, your church, whatever it is that you consider to be kind of your inner circle, that decision was going to impact them in some way, shape, or form. That's part 1. Part 2 go back in time, find something in your life. And we call this the trough. And this is the reason why it's the wave method. You got the crest, the trough, and the break. The trough is that moment in your life where you weren't sure you were going to be able to make it through, but somehow you did. And that low point in your life, right? That moment of powerlessness is your greatest source of power going forward. And then we come back to the idea, what was the decision that you made? And then we talk about the break. This is where you start to say, okay, I made the decision that I was going to accept that job in Jacksonville, Florida. Great. I lost friends. Sad. I embarked on a career that I found immensely fulfilling. I developed a team. I grew a brand. It gave me a chance to spend more time with my friends and family. A lot of positives that come from that. And then the fourth part of it is finally wrap it up with a reason for the telling. I might tell that story to you, and the two of you say, oh, Mark, I totally understand why you're sharing the story with me. Not always. And so it's really important to say, so why did I share that story with you? Well, let me tell you, the challenges that we've got ahead for our organization require us to be resilient. Or what we need to do is we need to have more faith in some of our other departments in our organization. Or, the reason I told you the story is because sometimes trust is broken. We need to do that long, hard road of rebuilding the trust. The point in all of it is that when you can put that into a story, a human story, the story that's based on my authentic life, it's something that's going to live forever in your hearts and minds, and it's going to guide the success of our organization going forward.
Oh, I love that. I absolutely love that, because I sit here all the time with leaders and I tell them to tell that story for the reasons. I don't get into the detail you have. Of course, I'm not going for a PhD either, but that's the point. And you see people's response to it. It's got to be authentic. There's got to be a point to it, as you said, and it helps loosen them up and make them more identifiable. And when you're trying to get people to, jump in the water with you, that's a great way to do it. So thank you for putting a nice big bow on the storytelling aspect. That was awesome.
And may I also add that you basically just gave me my entire opening for an all-day session tomorrow. Thank you. That was really helpful. I just heard this and was like, oh, I can say this. I can say that.
Oh, she has her transcription on ready. She's ready to go.
Totally. But I will use the formula as you just outlined it to structure some comments for a really big thing that, we have to tackle. And when you said, the fourth part, your reason for the telling, and why am I bothering to open up like this? Why am I sharing?
Is, right? You have to you have to explain that, right?
Yeah. And it's not always so clear to you. In my instance, I think I would spend the most time thinking about the reason for the telling to make it as credible as possible. The other components, they seem a little more logical, but really making that connection between this sharing of vulnerability, sharing of experience, et cetera, to how does this impact how our organization needs to move forward at this exact moment, right? That's just a huge connector. And I think it's one that lots of leaders honestly fumble or just maybe even leave out.
We do. I will say this just as a couple of things that are related to that. Is a lot of times we start off by asking, we ask before you even develop your story, what do you think is the story that your team or department or group or organization most needs to hear? And that's a little bit of a test of the situational awareness. How connected are you to what's really going on in the organization? And if you've done a good job of it, in a lot of ways, think about how many stories, Eileen, that you could tell about yourself that really kind of capture that. There's a million, right? There's a million iterations and permutations of what you got. And then the other thing is, so we ask that up front, like, what is the story that you think that they want to hear? And then afterwards, you develop your story. The best part of that too is once you've developed your story, you can keep coming back to the reason for the telling, because I'll bet your story could be applied in different scenarios, right? It could address this issue of, say, reputation rebuilding, but it could also be one of just, your same story could be recast in a way of connection. And I think those are things that once you've kind of gone down that path and developed it, you have a really great flexible tool for how you engage with different organizations.
Your input has been incredible. Mark Heisten, thank you so much for joining us. Eileen, would you like to say goodbye to your friend here?
I would, but only for now. We'll be talking again soon because, he's just a great guy. I'm lucky to have him in my life, and I'm really happy that you made time to be with us today. Super grateful for all of your guidance and advice, and I hope our listeners take tons of it to heart. We will include in our show notes information on how you can learn more about everything that Mark shared today and how you can even connect with him or seek him out on LinkedIn. Just a font of wisdom in this capacity. So thanks for being here. And that will do it for another episode of Can You Hear Me?
That's right. Thanks for joining us, Mark. We appreciate it. Your expertise was awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
And so that's it for our latest edition here. I'm Rob Johnson. We love to hear from you all, our listeners. So if you have any thoughts on today's today's topic or any other topic you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please reach out to us on social media.